Ok, vamos a empezar. Buen día, bienvenidos y bienvenidas, o bienvenides a todos. Perdón por la demora, estábamos resolviendo temas de distintos tipos. Bien, quisiera contarles antes de empezar, aquellos que les voy a recordar algunas partes del programa, pero quisiera empezar diciéndoles que este encuentro es continuidad de otro que hemos organizado junto con Katinka Evers en el 2015 en el CEMIC, en diciembre, en el que trabajamos sobre temas de neurociencia, pobreza infantil y neuroética. En diciembre de 2017 nos juntamos con Katinka en el barrio de Palermo, en Buenos Aires, y nos propusimos darle continuidad a ese encuentro que habíamos organizado. En este caso en particular nos preocupaba lo que la evidencia neurocientífica en los estudios de pobreza implicaba al interior del campo neurocientífico, pero también en la interacción con otros sectores académicos y no académicos, distintos sectores de la sociedad. Y siguiendo ese hilo de pensamiento y esa propuesta y discusión, llegamos a los objetivos de este encuentro, que son los siguientes 4. El primero es presentar el estado del arte de la evidencia neurocientífica contemporánea sobre los estudios de pobreza. El segundo es debatir acerca del alcance y las implicancias de tal evidencia para informar el diseño, la implementación y evaluación de políticas. El tercero es discutir acerca de las razones explícitas y las vías a través de las cuales tal evidencia es utilizada o abusada en la narrativa científica y política contemporánea, particularmente en nuestra región, en Latinoamérica. Y en cuarto lugar, y fundamentalmente, no dejar de lado en nuestras discusiones, espero que eso ocurra en el día de hoy, lo esperamos con Katinka, no dejar de lado las implicancias de la particular realidad política, social y económica que vivimos en el mundo y en particular en América Latina en estos tiempos, que nos convoca como científicos y miembros de otros sectores a no ser indiferentes a cuestiones como la deshumanización, el racismo, el paupericidio y las inequidades de género que estamos viviendo en la actualidad. El encuentro tiene 2 bloques. En el bloque matutino,
issues that have to do with what we are living nowadays. First, I'm going to give an introduction to the topic, and afterwards we're going to have Marta Farah via video conference. After that, we're going to have Nikolas Rose, and then 1 hour short break and 1 hour discussion. In the afternoon, there's a luncheon on the first floor of this venue, and then we're going to have a round table with Cecilia Hidalgo, Katinka Evers, Nikolas Rose, and the professor from University of San Martin could not come because he is on the road because he has been called upon by the new authorities of Argentina. And I want to say that what we are living today, both here face-to-face or via streaming, this is being put on Facebook. This is a collective effort with more than 40 people who collaborated, apart from the audience present here. Also, apart from celebrating this collective effort, I want to give special thanks to Katinka Evers and the association she represents. I want to thank all of the speakers from our country and other countries and authorities of all the technical teams, people doing sound, safety, cleaning, the interpreters, the streaming people, the technicians of the Uppsala University, and applied neurology and philosophical investigation. Please, let's switch what we are seeing on the screen so that we can explain that everybody who's present here. Before my presentation, please, I want to mention, as you can see, there is a website, or you can download the application or go to the website via your smartphone or use your computer and go to slido.com. And you have the name of the event, which is in Spanish, political uses of evidence in neuroscience on poverty. We are going to receive the comments and read your comments in the discussions that we are going to have here. This information is going to be repeated by the streaming team at different points today. Okay. Now, if we could go to my presentation, please. First thing that I want to do is tell you about the bibliometrical profile in neuroscience studies of poverty. Marta Farah is going to refer to this, but if you enter a search with words like poverty and neuroscience, we are going to find 179 papers where they refer to neuroscience technology. We're talking about technology that gives us the opportunity to give information about the neural area. And what we're going to discover is this curve, upward curve, where we have 179 papers distributed over the decades, and there's a big emphasis in the last 8 years. Out of that literature, 74% is empirical work, then reviews and perspectives or projections, and most of the papers, or half of them, provide information with data about structure, anatomical data, and the rest of the papers have functional information with different techniques. In most of the studies, half of them refer to children, and the rest is distributed between adults and kids, and teenagers. 73% of the empirical studies were produced in the United States. That means that there's an imbalance in the culture of origin, and this is the distribution of the studies in the rest of the world: Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Oceania. The summary of these papers say that exposure to any type of poverty can be associated to changes in the structure and function of the neural system, that is the neural conclusion. And something that is very important is that this is associated with an increase in allostasis. That is to say, the physiological wear and tear, which means that poverty works in a silent way, affecting different systems in the body. The neural changes can also be associated to systems of self-regulation, learning, and language. This is the cognitive area. These associations are correlations, not causal associations. And the moderators involved in the different factors are individual or contextual. And this field has been working for a decade and a half on moderators such as early linguistic environment, stressors, and epigenetic mechanisms, especially associated to stress. The few interventions that measure some kind of neural aspect in their design show or suggest that it is possible to change the neural resources of children exposed to poverty through different strategies. They show that changes, as in any other field, are not the same for all of the participants. That is to say, there's high variability given susceptibility to the interventions, and the potential of change question the impossibility of change by effect of poverty, and they question the hypothesis of deficit for poverty exposure. What we are accumulating in the last 5 years is evidence that suggests that we have to think about this in adaptative terms. The summary of these findings is that these associations are determined through lab evaluations that have little value. They are individual, And they can vary according to age, the cognitive paradigm that you use to evaluate the functionality, and the type of experience of poverty adversity. The scientific implications of what happens in neuroscience suggest that we are just scratching the surface of knowledge in connection with the connections between poverty and the brain. I'm talking about scratching the surface because this is the terminology that Dr. Farah has used, and this is what we think is a good contribution in neuroscience. We need to investigate more about the significance of the psychological implications of these associations, what happens with adaptation versus deficit, what's the timing for intervention, and what are the mechanisms where we need to work in order to identify some element of causality, not only association. And then there are different association methods and different time series because plasticity changes as we go along. Also, we need to continue understanding the modulation of individual and contextual factors. Also paying attention to the issue of diversity of different types of poverty. Another fundamental aspect where we need to continue working because of the diversity and susceptibility of impact is exploration of analytic methodologies that are relevant to give us an idea of nonlinearity of the development, and also emergency and multiple causality. We are also looking at asking ourselves what can be replicated and what's the degree of generalization we can attain, and also in this dialogue with politics, there's always and in this kind of emerging field, we have to be prudent regarding the recommendations we can make, and this implies that there are 4 areas where we can give a contribution to the dialogue. Number 1 is regulation of stress, nutrition, and sleep, and also physical exercise. Throughout the history of poverty studies, for example, in developmental psychology, that started very early on, the study of scientific issues that have to do with poverty is very recent. That means that we are looking at an emerging field where we need to study the specific relations and another set of implications that we need to discuss with other disciplines, and also within the field of poverty neuroscience studies, we need to check the cultural relevance of the conceptions and models that we use, especially regarding the intrinsic notions on childhood and development, and we have to exercise caution when it comes to cultural standardization. Also, we need to consider gender perspectives with more attention on the design of the studies, and that means that we need to make inter, and transdisciplinary efforts to co-build with other fields and disciplines. Not because there's a vertical information from our field that can be applied to public policies. Some of the tensions, and these are words used by Mariana Smuth, when you talk about the tensions that we live in this field, some of them have to do with enthusiastic positions and some with critical ones. Some of them happen in the field of neuroscience itself, and some others from other sectors. I'm going to just talk about 2. One has to do with the consideration of the critical periods as the single determinant for the mental or social capital as an adult, meaning that what happens in the first 1,000 days of your life determines the rest of your adult life. And the second one is to see that there are some colleagues that talk about policies that are based on neuroscience, but they are not sustained by evidence. So that means that inside our field there are tensions. Then there are some tensions that come from critical positions, and here I mentioned 4. One is the fact that we are accused that we are trying to redefine poverty from the biological point of view. This is something that you see in the media and some areas of academia outside neuroscience, and that can take many forms: determinism, reductionism, etc. Another one is that neuroscience is making a proposal for human development. This issue about the first 1,000 days as an irreversible factor is evidence of that. Another one is blaming caretakers as the responsible ones for the impact of poverty without taking into account that this has to do with cultural issues, and all of the organizational levels are involved. Neuroscience scientists are generating information in that sense, but we cannot sustain that idea apart from the issue of working with parents, of course, which is not questioned. And last one is functionality of our evidence to neoliberal ideologies. To finish my presentation, this puts us in a position that has to face challenges about what and how to take into account evidence for public policies, and that means that we have to debate and address the tensions in a context of plural ideas and respecting the other interlocutors, even if there's disagreement. I hope that can be seen today, and I hope we have a very good meeting today. Thank you. Now we're going to give the floor to Martha Farah, who's in Pennsylvania. She is a researcher and works in the University of Pennsylvania and in the CNS, the Neuroscience and Society of the University of Pennsylvania.
Wendy Amata. Okay.
My entire
yes.
finished.
Es todo tuyo.
Now, I just want to make sure that I can see my slides. Oh, just barely. Is there a way to get a little closer to the screen showing the slides? Better. Yeah, and yeah, that's good. I appreciate that. Okay, now let me say hello, thank you. Thank you to Sebastian and Katinka, and I'm very happy to be a part of this. And I am going to give a talk that has 2 parts. The first part is just summarizing some of the progress that has been made in the neuroscience of SES. And then the second part will be reflecting on some of the broader ethical and societal issues, political issues, policy issues that we are here to discuss. So let me begin by saying why apply a field like neuroscience to understanding a set of problems like poverty? Well, the next slide, please, advance, thank you, shows some of the life outcomes that are important for well-being and capabilities that are impacted by poverty, that are functions of the brain. So that's how we get into neuroscience here. The first slide that you see there shows the prevalence of symptoms of major depression from a epidemiology study done in Canada as a function of people's income. And you can see that the lowest fraction of earners has by far the highest rate of depression. and the depression goes down as people earn more money. This might seem kind of obvious, like, of course, if you don't have much money, you're more likely to be depressed. But look at the magnitude of that effect. The rate of depression doubles from lowest, is that 10th? I can't quite see from here, to highest. And that's a honking big effect for psychiatric epidemiology. There is something important going on here to be understood that would have a huge public health impact if we could understand it and use that understanding to do something useful. Okay, the panel on the right shows the relation between a measure of childhood family income and young adulthood IQ. And again, we see, I can look here. I have a printout of the slides. More than a standard deviation of IQ difference as a function of these different childhood family income bands. So next slide, or advance. Yes. Okay. So nope. That back up for 1 second, please. Thank you. And please, gentle audience members, bear with us as we try to make this remote slide system work. We tried for quite a while yesterday, and we could not get the online platforms, and we tried 3 of them to do it. So basically, the point that I want to underline here is that the brain isn't just any old organ that happens to be impacted by poverty. It's an organ that's central to the pathways linking poverty to some of the most influential and important life outcomes. Okay, now we'll go to the next slide. And this is just another graph, much like the one that Sebastian showed earlier. This shows just research reports, no review papers or opinion pieces or anything. And it shows the rapid, in fact, literally exponential growth in this field. That said, also echoing Sebastian's earlier comments, our ignorance is vast. We have a lot further to go. But this graph shows that there's reason to be optimistic, that people are working on this. And as I hope to convince you, progress is being made. So now the next slide, please. Okay. What I'm going to do, because the field is big enough now that it is impossible to summarize in an hour. In fact, it's, you could spend several days summarizing what's known. I'm going to try to give you examples. I'm going to exemplify our growing knowledge within the framework of the points on this slide. So basically, people have found differences in brain structure, in brain function that are relevant to cognition and emotion. And what has been found is not just phrenological localized differences, but also clues to what might be going on in the form of statistical mediation and moderation. And I'll explain what those are when we get to them. Okay, next slide, please. So this is an early study, relatively early, 2015. The biggest one to date of the structural correlates of SES in healthy young children. Kim Noble analyzed over 1,000 scans, MRI scans, of children from the Ping data set, and looked to see what areas of the brain showed the strongest relation between socioeconomic status and cortical surface area. And cortical surface area is it's a measure that correlates with many cognitive and emotional and health measures. So next slide, you will see these maps of the strongest correlations between SES, in this case income, and the cortical surface area. So you can see a fair amount of difference in medial, anterior areas, and difference in a number of areas. We could talk later if you're interested about what those areas are and what they might signify. But here I just want to point out that these are highly rigorously significant, with correction for multiple comparisons, all those kinds of statistical worries that we have about imaging. They should not worry us about this data set. Notice that income is correlated with brain structure here, and B, that it's not just the same everywhere. It isn't like brains overall get bigger when you have more money or when you're growing up in a family that has more money, but rather there are some localized differences. Let's go to the next slide. This is more data from Kim Noble's work, showing the relation between income and cortical surface area. Now, you may be looking at these and saying, "My God, if there's a slope in that line, it's a minuscule slope compared to the variability at a given level of income that people show." And if you were to say that, I would say, yes, you are right. This is a small effect, but it's real. You will only find it if you have a large sample. And one thing that you can discern in this large sample is that the effective income is greatest at the lowest levels of income. That is, the difference between going up a little bit when you're from a very low income family, going up a little in income, is greater than the difference of going up if you're, in middle class territory. And you can see that by the fact that fitted line bends down a little bit at the low end of the graph. So this is something that we see in many contexts, that SES differences are the most pronounced at lowest levels of SES, which suggests that perhaps that's a place to direct our efforts. And in fact, this conference is on poverty, which relates to that low end. Okay, next slide, please. You know what? Can you back up again for one moment? I am sorry. Yeah, thank you. There's one other thing I wanted to mention about the Noble data, and that is that the surface area measurement is not only correlated with socioeconomic status, and I hasten to add, after co-varying various relevant things, age, sex, genetic ancestry, and so forth. It's also correlated with the children's cognitive performance on some tasks, not all, and it mediates the relation between SES and cognitive performance. What does that mean? It means that we can account for some of the SES effect on cognition. You might recall that IQ graph that we looked at earlier. You can account for some of that effect in terms of the effect of SES on brain structure. So just to summarize what you've seen in this first example of SES neuroscience, you've seen a study of brain structure that in children that is correlated with cognition and actually helps explain, at least account for statistical variance in some of the cognitive effects. Okay, now we'll go to the next slide. Oops. And here, we're now going to look at a functional imaging example. You can see a few illustrative examples. We just did structural, now we're going to do functional. And we're going to look at an effect on emotional functions. And we're again going to find out about mediation. We're going to try to explain some of the SES effect with, this time, the functional brain effect. So let's see, let's go to the next slide. So this is a study by Pil-Young Kim, who's a neuroscientist at the University of Denver. She is interested, among other things, in maternal-child interactions and relationships, and how that is, on the one hand, shaped by socioeconomic context, and on the other hand, how that impacts the child. She invited a group of first-time mothers who had newborn children, infants anyway, into her lab. And she did a few things. The first thing she did was just record the interactions on videotape of the mother and child, and then had them scored by raters who were blind to the SES status of the mom, in order to assess the various basic behaviors in mother-child interaction that are predictive of later child well-being. And those include maternal warmth and maternal intrusiveness. And in a moment, we're going to focus on the intrusiveness. It kind of goes with being a little bit cold, a little bit controlling, not in tune with the child and what the child is interested in. Okay, so that's the first thing she did. The second thing she did is put the moms in a scanner. And she did a functional imaging experiment with these mothers, showing them pictures of infants, not their own infants, but just pictures of babies in general. Some of the babies were happy, smiling, contented-looking little babies, and others were fussing and crying and showing distress. I think we are ready for the next slide. What? Uh-oh. There we go. So what you can see here is the activity to the negative baby pictures. Mothers are just passively looking at pictures of fussy crying babies. Nobody thinks that's a fun thing to see. And we're plotting on the x-axis the income of the mother, say SES, loosely speaking, with the poor mothers at the left-hand side of the graph. And we're plotting income against amygdala activity, right amygdala activity. And so basically what we're seeing here is that unhappy baby pictures stimulate more actively the right amygdala in these moms, the lower the mom's income. That's a lot of words, but basically low SES moms, from the point of view of their amygdala, are more sensitive to unhappy baby pictures. Next slide, please. Now here we see the reaction of the mom's left amygdala, and let me mention that, in the intro textbooks tell you the amygdala is the center for negative emotion. That is an oversimplification. Other parts of the brain are involved in negative emotion, and the amygdala is also active in positive emotion and reward. Here is a case where that is true. So we're looking at amygdala activity to happy, smiling, contented babies. And here we see the amygdalas of the moms activate more to happy babies the higher the mom's income. Basically, to summarize in a kind of simplistic way, but it gets the point across, the moms, lower SES moms, are wired up, to use a simplistic analogy, to be more sensitive to the unhappy moments of baby emotion and less sensitive to the happy moments. Now, does that matter? Well, here's where we do the mediation analysis, because ultimately we don't really care that much about brain activity or structure, as in the Kim Noble study. We care about explaining how people turn out and live their lives and what they can do and how they feel. In this case, these amygdala activation results partly mediate the relation between SES and maternal intrusiveness. So the lower SES moms are more intrusive, to use the terminology of that coding system, and we can account for some of that statistical effect using these amygdala activations. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so far we have looked at structural finding related to cognition, functional finding related to emotion. We've seen that these findings mediate real-world outcomes. My last example is going to be an example of moderation. And I'm going to, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, I'll explain it as we go. Next slide. Okay, and next slide. So this is a study that was done by Demir about how children, what parts of the brain children use when solving simple arithmetic problems. She was interested in learning to what extent kids use verbal strategies or spatial strategies. Because, you can have verbally encoded number facts and sort of work through problems with a kind of a verbal mental scratch pad, or you can have a spatial approach and think about, number lines, Venn diagrams, and so forth. Different people do this different ways. So the first thing she did, and this is on the next slide, great, thank you, is carry out some localizer tasks. This means she had the kids in the scanner and gave them a verbal task and gave them a spatial task, and mapped out which parts of their brains were most active while performing those tasks. So she could say, okay, and these kids, when they're thinking verbally, this is what lights up. And when they're thinking spatially, this is what lights up. Okay, now, I think we're ready for the next panel. Thank you. What she found was that the lower SES kids tended to light up the spatial areas. And furthermore, their performance, how well they did on the math problems, was predicted by the activation of their spatial areas and not of their verbal areas. And the higher SES kids tended to light up the verbal areas, and how well they did on the math task was predicted by how active their verbal areas were and was not predicted by how well their spatial areas were. So what the word moderation here means is that the relation between the brain and what areas of the brain are activated and how well the kids do on the math problems depends on SES. To use the statistical term, it's moderated by SES. And what does this mean? It means that for whatever reason, kids growing up in lower SES homes tend to think about simple math problems spatially. Kids growing up in higher SES homes, where there is a lot more verbal stimulation and engagement, tend to think about the math problems verbally. That could have important implications for, education. A math curriculum, a math teaching method that works really well in, a high SES school might not work so well. You can't assume it will work well in a lower SES school if these kids are thinking differently. Okay, so that completes our tour of some illustrative examples of SES and brain research. I want to go to just touch on one other aspect of the science here, and next slide, please. The all-important question of how SES affects the brain. I've shown you a lot of facts. They're kind of descriptive facts. This is what a low SES brain looks like. This is the statistical relation between the brain and the ability as a function of SES. That, who cares? I'm willing to say, unless it's in the service of some longer range goal, which I'm here to say it is, just documenting these pretty pictures as a function of SES is not very useful. So the question of how these effects come about is a very important one, certainly very important for policy. And we don't know a lot. Okay, next slide, please. It's hard. It's hard to do research on this topic because if you're looking for causal mechanisms, every scientist says, okay, it's time to do an experiment. But you can't experimentally assign human beings to, different families of different SES. So instead, next slide, The evidence is a little more indirect, and with observational and quasi-experimental studies. I'm not going to stop and explain what those are. And animal models are in many ways great because you can have, experimental traction, but of course animals don't have SES. Human life is a lot more complicated than animal life. So on the next slide, I'm going to just walk through in cartoon form some of the proposed mechanisms that may be causing these SES differences in the brain. This is a little bit of a mix of different levels of explanation. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. And I would venture to say they're probably all involved at some level or other. So first of all, we know that verbal stimulation in the upper left corner, reading to your child, having conversations, is more common the higher in SES you go. The middle, stress, is higher in low SES for obvious reasons. Continuing further clockwise, pollution is a major factor in child development and in fetal development as well. And there's reason to believe that it synergizes with some of these other factors. That is, the effects are even worse if they're in the context of stress, for example. Continuing clockwise, we have our, requisite DNA epigenetics picture. We know that there are epigenetic changes that are associated with stress, for example, and pollution. We know that from animal studies. We also know it from some human studies. In fact, we even know there are SES effects on the epigenome. You may wonder what those two little figures covered with little colored bits are. That represents the microbiome, which is, a very interesting topic that people are now exploring. It turns out we have a two-way relationship with the population of microbes, of germs, that live on and in our bodies. And in terms of the two ways, the microbes actually impact our brains. They send chemical messages that alter brain function. We also know that the microbiome, the gut microbiome, differs across levels of SES. The burning match represents inflammation, which is, a sort of downstream product of stress, pollution, microbiome, etc. Nutrition is obviously an important topic for brain and brain health, brain development. And the last picture is supposed to represent the sort of emotional qualities of parenting. Now, this is can I say? If you do surveys, if you do observation, you actually find, in general, averaged across many families, you find more emotional supportiveness, patience, warmth, etc., at higher levels of SES. I want to say that sounds like it's kind of saying, oh, the poor parents are mean and nasty. That really does not follow. But what the data do show is that there are differences in levels of warmth and supportiveness as a function of SES, and that is illustrated by that last picture there. Okay, so next slide, and then we will leave the science. There are structural and functional correlates of SES. They're not just nice for publishing papers in neuroimage. They actually have relevance to SES-linked psychological outcomes. We have an emerging understanding of the causal pathways. This is, as Sebastian said, this is scratching the surface. And then next slide. There is lots more. Oh, there should be one more panel. Yes, thank you. There's lots more to say. These effects, appear to vary over the lifespan. There appear to be sensitive periods. There are all kinds of effects happening at genetic and molecular levels that may be, a big part of the story. Finally, I want to say, we are living through an era in science where we're suddenly realizing that, one finding, one study really does not settle anything. There are huge problems with replicability, which I think, the field has woken up to and people are being much more careful. But, how many of these things will replicate? And perhaps more important, how well will these findings generalize? If a finding is with American, urban, African-American children, does that generalize to American, Caucasian, rural children? You know what? Very, very little data has been collected with such kids. Does it generalize to low and middle income countries? Even less is known there. So basically, it's complicated. We need to be appropriately patient and and modest and say, it's going to take us a while to figure this out. Really, if you look at the neuroscience study of any important topic in human psychology, whether it, autism, intelligence, whatever, those fields have been at work on their problem for decades, and we still don't know much. So, we can't expect great things overnight. We need to be cautious. That's really all I want to say there. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. And I want to just talk a little bit about some of the ethical and policy issues. I meant to ask Sebastian before I started this, and I forgot. I sent an abstract, a title and an abstract that were a little grumpy. I don't know if that actually made it into the program or not. But, if my first conclusion is it's really complicated, nobody's offering any simple, true solutions at this point. My second 2 points, they were, for political reasons, people reject neuroscience, or, opportunistic people pushing certain policies embrace neuroscience. I think that's an overly cynical view of these problems. Let me turn to the ethical issues here and say, next slide. There are ethical risks. You can you can misinterpret. You can overly interpret the neuroscience with the effect, for example, that you might wrongly conclude, oh, so the brain is the problem. It's the poor face these reduced life chances, reduced well-being, etc., not because they lack economic opportunities, educational opportunities, affordable housing, and so forth, but because they have bad brains, right? That would be a terrible misinterpretation of this, this science. It's not either or. Of course, the brain effects that we're seeing here are, due in major part to the influence of just the structural factors that are named here. So, so we need to be careful that we don't do that and that we don't lead other people to stop worrying about the structural factors in poverty. But I think we also need to realize that the neuroscience does not inherently tell us not to worry about these other economic and social conditions. It just says, hey, big complex picture of individual in larger socioeconomic context, and we need to look at all parts of that system, including the brain. Next slide, please. Okay. Another unfortunate and unnecessary framing of the neuroscience is to see the poor as, patients, as sick, rather than as disadvantaged, and to therefore see them as like commodities, things. We objectify them. A brain is an object. So that would also be a bad thing to take away from this science, and it would, and it's a risk. So we need to be very clear about that. Finally, the last bullet point is something that, sorry, next slide, please, is something that Sebastian mentioned at the beginning, which is, the idea that, the brain, we think hardwired, we think permanent. And of course, that's a total non sequitur. There are, plasticity is a huge topic in neuroscience. The idea that there are limits on plasticity, as in sensitive periods, could be, again, misconstrued to say, oh, once they get to be 3 years old or 5 years old, they're just permanently damaged, nothing we can do. The critical period data, such that it is, it's not that clear, says no such thing. And also neuroscience may have ways of manipulating critical periods. Takao Hench at Harvard is doing work on that front. Okay, next slide. Great, okay. Does neuroscience have a role to play in poverty policy? Well, this really divides people. And again, in terms of my grumpiness, I guess last summer when I sent Sebastian the abstract, there are people, I think, who are claiming way too much for the ability of neuroscience to provide concrete, sort of actionable help in addressing problems of poverty. So next slide. Okay, so there are the neuro enthusiasts who I think can be divided actually into different camps. There are people who seem to really believe that the neuroscience has, is giving us actionable, knowledge right now. And the people who are not confused about that, but are, you might say, exploiting or using. That's a nicer word. They're using the neuroscience as a tool of persuasion to argue for certain policy outcomes. And the next slide. And then there are the neuroskeptics who are, saving the world from neuromania, because there certainly is a backlash. Okay, we're going to take a quick look at some examples of neuropolicy enthusiasm on the next slide. And you know what? Let me just ask you, I'm not even gonna talk through these, I think, for the sake of time and the awkwardness of slide advancing. Let me ask for 6 slide advances in a row. Perfect. Thank you so much. So, what you see here are, this last one to appear, I think, oh gosh, hold on. Oops. Yes. The last one to appear is, from a organization that works with low-income women to low-income adult women to empower them financially. It gets them into the world of work and helps them, support themselves, flourish economically. And, as you can see, there's all kinds of neuro talk in there, but there's no neuroscience behind this, okay? It's being used metaphorically. Metaphors are fine, but I just think we need to be aware when we're using metaphors and when we're really using neuroscience. It's nice. It's nice to be clear about what reality is. Okay, next slide is going to be the neuroskeptics. I'm going to quickly go through this. Sample 3 neuroskeptics. The first is on the next slide, comes from the work of Charles Murray, Richard Herrnstein in, I guess it was the 90s, arguing that, in fact, a big part of what makes people poor or rich, low or high SES, is their innate ability, which means, that's a sort of a biological argument based on genetics for saying this is not really, there's really no point in society investing to improve the environments of the poor and of poor children, because the environments aren't the problem. Next slide is a book that came out, maybe 15 years ago, perhaps longer, by John Brewer. And I regret that I can't see the notes that go with this, but he's a smart, funny, very critical writer, and he reports on attending a White House conference during the Clinton administration that was about brain development and how to foster brain development in poor children. They had Carla Schatz, an eminent developmental neuroscience there, neuroscientists there, and various other people. And just to give you some background, to appreciate the reconstructed quote that I'm going to give you, Carla Schatz studies visual system development in cats. Cats are her model animal. So, Brewer says, well, I went to this conference. It was supposed to be about the quote unquote new neuroscience and its implications for, child poverty. But I didn't see anything new, and I didn't see any connection between the neuroscience and child poverty. And at one point he says, there was, if there was a connection between blind kittens and welfare, I did not see it. So, yeah, not a fan. The final book that I want to display, a more recent book by Sally Sattel and Scott Lilienfeld, is a broader attack on the idea that neuroscience can solve everything. You got a social problem, call the neuroscientists. And it's a not unreasonable book. I don't agree with everything it says, but I think all three of these books, I don't agree with some or most of what they say, but they all articulate, reasonable challenges to this hope that neuroscience is going to solve problems of poverty. Okay, next slide, and we are getting to the end, fear not. So this is probably the most explicit critique of the use of neuroscience to understand child poverty. Awkwardly enough, it was written by a colleague of mine, Amy Wax. And I do think she does a great job of, sort of isolating sort of key complaints against the neuroscience approach. But I also think there are, good responses to all of these complaints. So next slide, we're going to look at the first complaint, which is basically the Herrnstein-Murray idea, which has been, okay, let's just go through the next few until we get to Arthur Jensen. One more. Okay, great. So, the idea here that Amy Wax is arguing for is that these differences that we see in children's brains as a function of their SES or as a function of being poor, Jensen is saying, it may have nothing to do with the environment. It may have to do with perhaps genetic differences. That is his position. And as you can see, this was an old study, 1969. He says social class variations in intelligence, and we can say or brain structure, cannot be accounted for by differences in the environment. And of course, the thing that follows from that is that, or may follow from that, doesn't logically follow, I would say, is that we don't, there's no point in trying to improve the environments if the environments are not what is to blame for disparities in achievement, intelligence, mental health, and so forth. Next slide. Okay. The next point that I want to go to is on the upper right, and it's that there are no unique contributions or special insights that come from neuroscience. And, you know, I think, at least for now, that's true. And I think it's a problem that some of my colleagues have in the past, you know, said, well, now we have this neuroscience knowledge, we can really get to the heart of what's going on. You know, we can open the black box and see what the problem is. But here's a question. Is it important for neuroscience to offer unique insights to be valuable? And I want to say the answer is no. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. So, you know, if you want to, if you're doing exciting cutting edge science, then you want to learn something that has never been known before. On the other hand, if you want to make policy, you want to accumulate a weight of evidence. You want lots of data pointing in the same direction. So next slide. What you want to publish in science is something, you know, new and surprising, right? On the other hand, next slide, if you want to make policy, you want to add to the weight of evidence. And weight of evidence, you know, you can try to sort of quantify it and formalize it, but really part of what it tends to be more qualitative, particularly in that the more different kinds of source of evidence that you bring to bear is significant, is reassuring. So if you know, say that, like, you know, stress is bad for kids. Well, you know, it's easy to say, oh, you know, you don't need a neuroscientist to tell you that stress is bad for child development. And there are, in fact, good, you know, psychological studies that do show that. But if you also have neuroscience pointing in that direction, well, maybe that increases your willingness to, for example, devote a few minutes of precious, you know, primary care pediatrician time to asking the parent or caregiver about stress levels in the household, and maybe refer them to help with that if it's needed. So I think, again, it's not about the flash and novelty. It's about the solidity and weight of the evidence. And I think even now, neuroscience is contributing to weight of evidence for things like, you know, the deleterious effects of stress, which is more common in low SES homes, on brain development. Whoop, hang on. My dog is destroying something. Very sorry. Okay. So, okay, we are ready for the next slide. Okay, finally, does the neuroscience offer any actionable new information? so sorry. You know what? Let me just deal with this and then be right back. Okay, thank you. So, actionable information. Well, I think it's, too early to expect that of the science. Life is short, science is long, but, above and beyond sort of providing converging evidence for certain actions, as in the stress example. But I do think we can look ahead and, imagine ways, non-crazy imagination of ways that the neuroscience could help. And that is the next slide, which I will just quickly walk through with you, and then we'll conclude. Next slide. Great, thank you. Okay, well, so one possible contribution comes from these moderation type findings where you see qualitative differences as a function of SES that could lead to different interventions. It could certainly lead to investigating the potential of different interventions at different levels of SES. Next slide. It also offers the potential for biomarkers, biomarkers for research. That is, is this intervention going to help this person? For example, for screening and prediction. Now, screening and prediction can seem like ominous practices, and certainly they can be used in bad ways. However, educators now use screening and prediction, and at least in principle, they could be very positive. So that's especially important early in life. If you're talking about infants or very young children whose behavioral repertoire is very limited. Sort of normal behavioral forms of screening and prediction are not going to be practical and not going to be possible. Next slide. The neuroscience research I'm going further and further out here, more and more speculative, but the neuroscience research may reveal windows of opportunity for protecting brain development. In particular, the prenatal period, not surprisingly, is, has a very big influence on lifelong health and well-being. And we have seen differences in prenatal brain development as a function of SES. We've seen differences in prenatal brain development as a function of some of the causal factors that you saw the cartoons of before, pollution and stress, for example, inflammation. It's been possible to people have done this work, correlate these effects with later life, postnatal life, health and well-being and abilities. And in some cases, you can actually even focus on a particular trimester of pregnancy where these environmental effects have the biggest influence. Now, in a perfect world, people would have an optimal environment from conception through old age, right? But it's not a perfect world. And I think it's fair to ask if we, is there some particularly impactful period to intervene? And I think, for 9 months of pregnancy, maybe, or, even 3 months of a certain trimester, you might be able, it certainly is more practical to improve nutrition, protect people from pollution, stress, etc. This is very speculative, just a thought I'm throwing out there. And then next slide. Finally, this is farther out in time and maybe far out as an idiom as well. But, there are ways of manipulating epigenetics. There are ways of manipulating, reopening critical periods. These are not used in humans yet, but again, we're talking far out into the future. And the microbiome, which can be manipulated by things like fecal transplants as well as, probiotics and so forth. These are just a few, Martha's musings, science fiction future. But they're meant to illustrate that, in principle, the neuroscience can give us actionable data. Okay, next and final slide. First, next slide. And, basically, the words are all here, so I'll just read. The neuroscience of SES is a young science. This will be a long game we need to proceed with patience. In particular, we need to not overpromise. We need to not say we know more than we do. And we need to not conclude that it's all hopeless because we haven't, achieved a lot yet. My dog is impatient because he thinks we haven't achieved a lot yet. Excuse me, just 1 minute. Okay, very sorry. Next slide. Okay, so there are ethical risks. That is, the neuroscience can be used as part of a narrative that objectifies people, pathologizes people, and distracts us from needed social change. But because, yes, you can misuse these ideas. It's not inherent in them. Next slide. I would say there is some overreach. People being a little too enthusiastic about what can currently be done in support of policy. And there's some backlash against that. That's the way the marketplace of ideas works. That's all good. And then last point. We have already, one more slide. We've already made modest contributions. For example, by emphasizing by adding to the weight of evidence that stress is harmful, and maybe a little bit on some of the language material as well, the importance of give and take with language. John Gabrielli has done some fantastic work linking the brain to that and SES. And there's, I think, lots of future potential. So my final and very important slide is, next slide, to thank you all for your patience and thank the organizers, Sebastian and Katinka, for including me. I'm very much looking forward to Nikolas Rose's talk, and I apologize for I hope I didn't go over time here. I may have, sorry about that. And I apologize for my dog issues. Thank you.
Gracias, Marta. Muchas gracias. Ahora es el turno de la conferencia del profesor Nikolas Rose, profesor investigador del King's College de Londres. Por favor, Nick.
Esta es la que tenemos.
Sí.
No supongo que la vamos a ver.
Do you want water here?
Yeah.
You have the...
That's the clicker.
Do you know it? How
Yeah.
it is? Okay.
Yeah, I know it. Okay. We're just going to take a couple of minutes whilst I organize myself, and maybe you take a bit of a breath between myself and Martha Farah. I'd like to just start in this interregnum by thanking Sebastian and Katinka for organizing for me to come here, and to you for coming to listen to this event, and also to the people who are streaming this. I should have brought my dog with me, so I'm sorry for not bringing the dog. And I'm bearing in mind and trying to keep bearing in mind the comment that Sebastian made right at the beginning, that we need to treat our disagreements with generosity. Because I should say in advance that I find myself in quite a lot of disagreement with both parts of Professor Farah's argument, both with her interpretation of the science and with her interpretation of the policy. I am very ancient. Is this going to have my first slide, please? Sebastian, is this not happening? It's coming. From 1972 to 1975, getting on for half a century ago now, my first proper paid job was with an organisation in the UK called the National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And we were looking not only at families where there was a fear of child abuse, but also at families where there was a worry that children might not have adequate development because of poverty in the family. Now, there is an old saying in English which is, what goes around comes around. What goes around comes around. Half a century later, I find many of the same arguments, which in those days were framed in terms of psychological development, now framed in terms of neuroscience. And I very much regret to say I don't find the arguments that much more convincing now than I did then. So, a few words in introduction. I guess the main question which I want to focus on in my hour here is whether and what contemporary neuroscience can tell us about the impact of social injustice on the bodies and brains of our fellow citizens. Can it avoid neurobiological determinism in all the different ways in which that can underpin our explanations? What does this contemporary work on the neurobiology of poverty add to our knowledge that adversity blights the lives of children and of the adults they will become? To put it crudely, we know that poverty is bad for children. We know that children brought up in poverty tend themselves to live in poverty. They have their own families in poverty, and the children of those families also live in poverty. poverty is reproduced across the generations. Can neuroscience tell us anything new or anything actionable about the way in which and the reasons why poverty is reproduced across the generations? What can contemporary neuroscience contribute to strategies for social justice? Now, I should say in advance that I've spent the last 20 years working very closely with neuroscientists. We've founded a research centre at King's College London, which is trying to develop the kind of collaborative relations between the social scientists and neuroscientists that I think are necessary. So this is not a talk against neuroscience, although some of you will hear it as that, but it's a talk for being very careful and thoughtful about how we understand A, the nature of neuroscientific research and the evidence it produces, and B, the consequences that we draw from that, both the two parts of Professor Farah's talk. Now, if it comes to physical health, we know very clearly that there are many social determinants of physical health, and they are becoming widely accepted. We know that health, morbidity, life expectancy is much worse for those who are born and live in social adversity, and we can map this out even across one city in the difference, for instance, in life expectancy between two regions in Glasgow, in Scotland. Life expectancy at birth for men in one region about 47 years, life expectancy for birth in men in another region of the same city around 70 years. Massive differences in life expectancy. And we can understand why those differences in life expectancy have occurred, partly to do with things that happen in childhood, partly to do with diet, with nutrition, smoking, stress, and so on. Many have focused on stress pathways, but as we'll see, what exactly is meant by stress is very, very unclear. There is much disagreement about the lifelong consequences of early childhood experience, and there is much disagreement about whether or not what's involved is something to do with the lifestyle of the parents and the families, their attitudes, their behavior, the fact that they're all eating McDonald's and smoking and drinking, or whether actually one should look at the determinants in the environments in which they live. Nonetheless, in physical health, we know that the interventions that have made the most difference to life expectancy and morbidity are ones that operate at the level of public health and the population. And the most obvious is smoking. The most obvious has been public health measures to curtail smoking even before we knew the mechanisms that related smoking to lung cancer and to death. And very surprising consequences of stopping smoking as well. Not just the ones that you would expect in lung cancer, but the fact that rates of dementia in elderly people have not grown as fast as they were expected to grow. Some wonderful research by a colleague at Cambridge called Carol Brain has showed that actually, although the numbers of people with dementia are increasing, the graph from 20 years ago, which showed it increasing like that, is overestimated. Why has that overestimation happened? It's because the overestimation was when people were smoking, and as people reduce smoking, the rate at which people develop dementia reduces. Okay, public health measures that transform morbidity and mortality in physical health. Now we're moving to understand some of the social determinants of mental health, although they're being embroiled in similar debates. And yet in the field of mental health, interventions are almost entirely individual, focused on behavior change. So I just want to keep those two levels of intervention in our mind as we go through this presentation. We know, and from some of the arguments from Sebastian and from Martha, that the effects of poverty, adversity, and childhood stress and trauma on the brain, as opposed to those on the body, are highly controversial. On the one hand, as my earlier speakers have said, they're subject to much hype and simplification. On the other hand, they're subject to critique as reductionist, as deterministic, individualistic, fatalistic. The researchers themselves argue that their aim is to expose the malign effects of poverty and to support progressive social policies. And as Sebastián said at the very beginning, because they have a belief in neuroplasticity across the life course, explanations based on early experience and its effects on the brain are not determinist. But as we shall see in a moment, nonetheless, the interventions that are proposed are largely on the individual and on the family. And so the dilemma: does this research explain the reproduction of inequality across the generations, or does it legitimate it, enabling politicians of all sorts to say, what's to blame? It's not society, it's the family or the brain, it's not social injustice. So those are a few framing remarks. Now let's explore some of the details. The early years. Is the importance of the early years a truth that's withstood the test of time, or is it a myth as old as the Greeks? Was it Aristotle who said, give me a child until he's 7 and I'll show you the man? Or was it Ignatius Loyola who said, give me the child for the first 7 years and I will give you the man? Well, I don't know, but certainly they've been saying it for a very long time. There's nothing new at all in the argument that childhood experiences shape the character and capacities of adults, or that this shapes the capacities and character of the next generation, reproduction or transmission of poverty. If you look at debates in my own country, in the United Kingdom, in the 19th century, the reference was frequently made to what were called the social problem group, the submerged 10% of the population in which all the ills of society were concentrated: prostitution, mental illness, physical illness, gambling, and all the physical diseases and mental diseases as well, concentrated in this submerged 10%. As psychology developed across the second half of the 20th century and into the 19th century and into the 20th century, there was a big debate. On the one hand, as I'm sure almost everybody here is aware, eugenicists argued that these were character traits which were determined by genetics. And I was a bit surprised, actually, that Professor Farah, in her presentation, referred to the bell curve, Herenstein and Murray, and indeed to Arthur Jensen's widely discredited research. These genetic determinists who sought to reactivate eugenic policies after the Second World War, where we had seen their consequences. So on the one hand, those eugenicists argued about the determining consequences of eugenics. Most psychologists, on the other hand, argued that what was at stake were mother-child relationships, attachment, love, whether the nature of mother-child interaction, the forms of ontological security that were given to the child. When I worked at the National Society Prevention of Cruelty to Children in 1972 to 1975, we saw exactly the kind of rating of mother-child interactions that Professor Farah talked about. Only those interactions between mother and child were interpreted in psychological terms rather than in neurobiological terms. What goes around comes around. In the 1970s, which, as I say, before all you guys were born, but when I was still around, this was framed in a very powerful set of arguments in the United Kingdom called the cycle of deprivation. It was made powerful because in those days of what we used to call then Thatcherism, one of Margaret Thatcher's key thinkers, Keith Joseph, argued very strongly that what was a consequence for the reproduction of poverty were the early child experiences of poor families. Children of poor and problematic families were themselves more likely to experience poverty and other social problems, and the reason was poor parenting, lack of stimulation, poor role models at home, bad neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. And as you'll see, getting confused here between my slides. as you'll see in the images here, many big debates about this so-called cycle of disadvantage, the way in which the parents were being blamed for this, and as a consequence, the emergence of one particular form of intervention that sought to counter cycles of disadvantage. And this was early childhood intervention. Because, as it was argued, it was the period in the early childhood, the first 3 to 5 years, that was responsible for setting the life course of the child across the whole of its growth and maturity. What one needed to do was to intervene early in order to counter the malign elements within that early childhood experience. You needed to produce positive role models, you needed to develop abstract thought in the child, you needed to help the child develop what was called elaborated language. I did my PhD in the department of an educational sociologist called Basil Bernstein. And Basil Bernstein argued that the difference between working class kids and middle class kids was that working class kids had a very restricted language, one that was very concrete in its reference to what was happening in the world outside, was always relating to very specific examples, whereas middle class kids had an elaborated language. They could speak in abstractions. And the reason why the middle class kids did well in school was because the school and schooling was based upon the use of this elaborated code. Middle class kids could also use the restricted code when they were playing in the playground. Working class kids could not move into the elaborated code. Huge amount of research which was done in those days by Bernstein and his colleagues, very heavily criticized, and the empirical research simply failed to demonstrate that there was a difference between the use of language in these ways between middle class and working class kids. Nonetheless, the argument in those days was that what you needed was intervention to compensate for the poverty of the child's experience in its early years. Parent training, preschool playgroups, and in the United States, Operation Head Start, taking children from the most disadvantaged families and placing them in preschool and early school education to stimulate them in order to compensate for those early unstimulating experiences. And not surprisingly, this argument that early stimulation was crucial for the development of the child wasn't lost on middle-class parents, and pretty soon you saw a whole wonderful commercial industry in producing all these stimulating toys to stimulate the brains of kids, largely, of course, expensive toys made out of very expensive wooden blocks and not available to the very working class kids who they initially had been experimented on. Many social scientists in those days were highly critical of these kinds of explanations. They argued, as I'm sure you're aware, that they were very reductionist and individualist. They saw inequalities as rising from differential brain capacities of individuals, either inherited or inscribed in poor mother, child, and family experiences. Inherited, now some people had thought that the influence of genetics on these kinds of arguments had rather waned as eugenics had become completely discredited. But one has seen the emergence of a new form of genetic explanation, not eugenic, but one which argues something different. It doesn't argue about general intelligence or IQ, but it argues that children with different genetic complements have different patterns of capacities in different domains. And if you can begin to assess those different patterns of capacities in these different domains, you can adapt your schooling to the particular capacities, inborn capacities of the child. This argument made very strongly and controversially in the UK by a colleague of mine, Robert Plomin, who works in the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College London. And I believe greatly overestimates the importance of inborn genetic complement on the development of what we still call intelligence. And again, I was quite surprised in hearing Professor Farah's presentation that she seemed to rely rather unproblematically upon the IQ test as a measure of intelligence. Well, let's not go into the history of the IQ test and why the IQ test and how the IQ test was standardized, but the IQ test measures certain very specific capacities and calls those intelligence. It's standardized to measure those very specific capacities and call those intelligence. The IQ test is standardized these days so it doesn't show differences between males and females. How is that done? That is done by the choice of items in the IQ test. In other words, the IQ test is a highly arbitrary and constructed measure of certain specific sorts of capacities. And it's not particularly surprising to me that those would be the capacities which kids tend to pick up in middle-class homes with lots of those little stimulating toys and parents reading to the kids, etc., etc., etc. It's not surprising that the IQ test measures the kinds of things that middle-class kids give to their families and doesn't measure the kinds of practical intelligence that working class kids gain from their life in their families. So poor school performance and poor test performance is not due to lower intellectual capacity, but certainly in these early arguments, it was due to the form of the test and the nature of educational practices themselves. And finally, and perhaps most powerfully, the argument that was made by social scientists back in those days was that the transmission of poverty arose not from intellectual deficit, but from embedded structural inequalities. Most of the research which we've heard about so far today has been in the United States. Now, I don't know how many of you know very much about the education system in the United States, but you don't have to know very much about the education system in the United States to know that it is highly differentiated by area, differentiated by class, and in particular differentiated by ethnicity. To put it very, very crudely, black working class kids have a rotten time in schools because they have rotten, overcrowded and underfunded classes. They have the poorest and most hard-working teachers working there, and they get the worst possible educational experience. That's a huge overgeneralization, I know, but if you're going to tell me that the reason why working class black kids in the United States do badly in tests of educational attainment is because of something that happens to their brains in the early years, I'd say first show me that they're getting an equal educational experience to every other kid, and then if there are still differences, let's have a look and try and explain what those differences are. Housing, toxic environment, poor food options, racial discrimination, violence, welfare regimes, structural discrimination, all the things that Professor Farah mentioned at the end are there right at the beginning. And I would put it to you, if I was a lawyer speaking to a jury, I would put it to you, members of the jury, that perhaps those are the things that you need to look at first before going to the brain. As it was often said back in the day when I was a lad, a radical, long-haired hippie, I know, carrying my signs against the war in Vietnam, etc., 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 education cannot compensate for society. Well, now I'm no longer a radical, long-haired hippie. I still carry the same signs. So, back to the future then. Are we seeing the neuroscience of poverty simply repeating what we heard before in neural terms? So here's an example from the United Kingdom from about 10 years ago. About 10 years ago, a member of Parliament called Ian Duncan Smith, a Conservative, and a Labour member of Parliament called Graham Allen set up a Centre for Social Justice. And the Centre for Social Justice was, as the name implied, a centre to try and produce social justice, especially amongst poor families. And perhaps the most influential publication from the Center of Social Justice was this publication, which I show you here on the right-hand side of the screen. And you don't have to be a great discourse analyst to see that, first of all, two brains are shown there. The first on one side is the brain of a child who has been extensively stimulated through its relationship with its parents. And the second is the brain of a child who's lacked early stimulation. Conclusion drawn from that was that early stimulation has massive consequences for the brain. And conclusion drawn from that, and I mean, it happily be the case that these individuals were not terribly subtle. You can't actually see that over there, but if you look at the picture over there, there are the brains on one side and there are gold bars on the other. What do the gold bars indicate? The gold bars indicate the cost to society. You can see there's only one gold bar next to the highly stimulated brain. Doesn't cost society very much. There's lots of gold bars next to the unstimulated brain. That's the cost on society. These are the social problem group that cause society a huge amount of cost and investment. And the explanation that's given as the consequence of the early years of life on the child's brain. The text here, I don't know if it's legible up there. The early years are far and away the greatest period of growth in the human's brain. It's been estimated that the connections or synapses in a baby's brain grow 20-fold from having perhaps 10 trillion at birth to 20 trillion at age 3. The early years are a highly sensitive period. They set the basic architecture for life. And the argument here, as in so much of this, is that the first 1,000 days programs the child for the rest of its life. The path is set in the first 1,000 days. Attachment behavior is also involved. People with secure attachment show more healthy behaviors. They take exercise, they don't smoke, they don't use substances, they don't take alcohol, they drive at an ordinary speed, as opposed to parents who are neglectful, drunk, drugged, and violent, who have impaired capacity to provide the social and emotional stability, create the likelihood that adverse experiences might have a negative effect on their children's development. And the worst and deepest damage is done to children when their brains are being formed during the earliest months and years. Well, I suspect that our current neuroscientists of poverty would claim that here was a huge simplification and overextension of their argument. But I would suggest that perhaps the basic elements of this argument are contained in this argument that we see here, and are contained in all the newspaper reports which follow up these kinds of arguments. All right. Instead of showing you images of large and small areas in the brain, they show you images from MRI and fMRI scans. And there's a huge amount that we could talk about how those scans are produced and how those images are developed. We have time for questions afterwards. And if people want to ask those methodological issues about what produces these scans where bits light up and bits seem bigger than others, then I think we can have that discussion. But these are the kinds of arguments, and as we see, the arguments that differences in SES are associated with thinner subregions of the prefrontal cortex, less grey matter in certain areas, disparities of activation in particular brain areas, and differences in cortical volume and cortical thickness. So 2 things in passing about that, I guess one should say. First of all, SES. Now, in the United States, where people don't like to talk about class and class differences, they tend to talk about socioeconomic status. Do you know what they mean by socioeconomic status? Probably not, because it's very, very seldom defined. As you will have heard in Professor Farah's talk, SES for some of those experiments was money, income. SES in some measures of SES includes level of education. SES in other measures of SES, includes type of employment. In other words, SES, socioeconomic status, is a really crude attempt to categorize social differences. Does it include gender? No. Does it include ethnicity? No. Does it include social exclusion? No. Does it include sexual orientation? No. Does it include where you live? No. None of the above. So tell me if SES is a useful thing to correlate with anything, and I will say, well, probably not. Okay, as soon as we begin to get the argument that what happens in childhood affects the brain, as with the middle-class families buying all those expensive wooden blocks for their kids, you get the same fantasy. Oh, sorry, different slides. Oh, right, I've just explained that to you. Sorry, I've got two systems here. At least I don't have a dog, but I do have two systems here. Right, the fantasy world of commercial brain boosting. You can see the way in which this gets simplified, but don't think those simplifications are just in the fantasy world of the internet to flog things, because actually those simplifications are the kinds of simplifications that appeal to those who are trying to make policy. Believe me, the people who are making policy do not read Nature. They do not read science. They do not read child development. They do not read the papers. They read the papers as they are mediated and mediated and mediated into these highly simplistic kinds of accounts. So our question then is, does the contemporary neuroscience of poverty bring anything new? Well, you heard Professor Farah talk about that, and I think the argument is probably accepted that the only thing that it brings new is the suggestion that there are certain specific regions of the brain or neural circuits that are involved here. Now, to be honest, I would not be at all surprised in thinking that poverty affects the brain. Standing up and speaking to you guys affects the brain. Being on the plane for 14 hours between London and here affects the brain. And I wouldn't be surprised that the half cow that a dear friend of mine provided for me for lunch yesterday to help me get the full Argentinian experience also affected my brain. It certainly knocked me out for the rest of the day. Does it matter which bits of the brain are affected as long as something is happening north of the neck? I don't really mind if it's happening in the amygdala. I don't really mind if it's happening in the hypothalamus. And in fact, what strikes me also is that these arguments still hang on to a very outmoded idea that specific functions and capacities are localized in specific regions of the brain. Actually, these are artifacts produced by the way in which the experiments are done, and almost every function, including my exhaustion after eating my wonderful steak, I know no offense to Argentinian steak, or to my wonderful friend Sylvia Grimberg, or to the bottle of Malbec that we drank over lunch, all excellent. But what was affected in my brain was not particularly my amygdala, my hypothalamus, but a whole set of neural circuits dispersed across the brain and not picked up in the kinds of experiments that are used here. Does research still individualize the persistence of inequity, even as it points to its socio-economic origins? Does it encourage fatalism, that the life path of those born in poverty is determined by their earliest years? And does it excuse socio-political processes? Well, I think the answer to some of those questions is yes, and we'll get on to those in a second. Firstly, Professor Farah referred to the science. Now, I was originally a biologist, and although I rather blench at the word science when it's got a capital S, I think that scientific research and argument based on rigorously carried out experiments and with very modest and careful conclusions is something to be highly admired. But I don't think one always finds that here. As I've already said, when you rely on an IQ test to identify whether there are differences in cognitive capacities, what you're relying on is a test which is standardized in such a way that it measures certain things and it doesn't measure other things. And that was the case of the IQ test that we used when I was a lad back in the 1980s, and that's the case now. So when anybody shows me a graph of a performance on an IQ test, I want to say, well, how familiar is the child with carrying out the sorts of tasks or answering the sorts of questions that are used in an IQ test? Go and look at an IQ test schedule and ask yourself whether you think a kid brought up in a middle-class family is more likely to be familiar with answering those questions than a kid brought up in a working-class family. Secondly, as I've said, and I think this is pointed out very clearly in some work by Sebastián Lipina and Katinka Evers in some of the recent papers that they've produced, there's absolutely no consensus on what is the index of poverty that you use. And SES is a really bad index if you're trying to look at social deprivation. Thirdly, as you saw from Professor Farah's presentation, there are huge variations between individuals. So when you sum all those variations into one claim, I think you're missing something really important. Fourthly, they're based on widely outdated ideas about the localization of function. And as it happens, there are huge variations in neuroanatomy, even between identical twins when they get to be 2 or 3 years old. Any implication about causality is very hard to draw from these studies, and we know very little about the complex temporal development of the brain. And development in the brain certainly persists beyond the first 1,000 days. As I say, I'm working in this centre at King's College on society and mental health. One of my colleagues, Craig Morgan, has done a huge amount of work on children's development, in particular focused on the adolescence period. And the adolescence is a period of major reorganisation, synaptic reorganisation, brain reorganisation, and is highly dependent on the experience that the child has in adolescence. I was recently attended a lecture by a very prominent gerontologist, someone who works on old age at King's College London, Andrew Steptoe. Many interesting things in that lecture, but the one that caught my eye was that someone had done an experiment where some elderly people like me were taken out of our lonely and isolated existence and taken into schools where we would help kids with their reading. And so we were messing around with kids and with lots of stimulation, etc., etc., etc. And they did some measures afterwards where they measured the kids' reading ability, and unfortunately the kids' reading ability was completely unchanged by the fact that they had a lot of old guys hanging around. But then they measured the cognitive ability of the adults, and the cognitive ability of the adults was radically improved by their interaction with the kids. And then they stuck the adults into some MRI scans, and they found some major differences in the size of the hypothalamus and the reactivity of the amygdala in these adults as a result of their period of working with the kids. These are old guys like me. The temporality of neural development is not fixed in the first 1,000 days. I'm sorry for giving too many plugs to my colleagues at King's College London. But I have a very eminent scientist colleague in the Institute of Psychiatry called Michael Rutter, Sir Michael Rutter, done a huge amount of work on child development, and writing in 2002 at one of the early points in the development of this work. Michael Rutter, who's by no means, believe me, he's by no means card-carrying, long-haired, hippie, radical, lefty, etc., etc., draws the following conclusions in this paper called Nature, Nurture and Development, from Evangelism Through Science Towards Policy and Practice. These are more or less Mike Rutter's words. We can't extrapolate findings on experience expectant development to the entirely different notion that higher quality psychosocial experiences in the first 2 or 3 years of life will have a much greater effect than similar experiences later on. because the early experiences bring about a lasting change in brain structure. We cannot make that extrapolation. We cannot usefully extrapolate from rodent models to humans. The difference between the size of a mouse or a rat and the size of a human is 1,000-fold. The difference in the complexity of the mouse brain to the complexity of the human brain, the difference between the lifespan of the mouse and the lifespan of the human, especially those mice and rats that are bred generation after generation after generation to be laboratory animals. We know that human brain development, including neurogenesis, continues through adolescence and into April years. We've got little or no knowledge of mechanisms. We know that there's experience development brain plasticity across the life course, even in the case of those who have neurological differences because of extreme deprivation in the early years. Now, I'll say for a little aside here, Mike Rutter was one of those who was involved in the work on the Romanian orphans. I don't know if that work got much publicity here, but after the collapse of communism in Romania, many kids were found in Romania in orphanages where they basically being kept in bleak, completely unstimulating environments, sometimes tied to their beds if they had behavioral disturbances, certainly in bleak concrete shells with almost nothing to do. And they did scan their kids' brains. And indeed, those kids' brains did show signs of extreme deprivation of stimulation. But 10 years on, those signs no longer existed. 10 years on, those Romanian orphans, now adopted into other families, were doing as well as other kids who had not had these awful early childhood experiences. And that was work that Mike Rutter did. And it rather surprised him, actually, because he did believe that these early experiences would have lifelong consequences. So brain development across the life course is not set at infancy, but affected by adversity across the whole of the life. What about the interventions? I think, like in the early period when I was at the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, almost all the interventions focus on transforming the individual or transforming parenting. Early childhood intervention, intensive schooling experiences, parent training, nutritional supplements. You saw it on Martha Farah's side. Very few focus on transforming the environment of poverty and adversity itself. The environments, the food choices, the welfare regimes that throw many people into poverty, the lack of basic income security and economic security, stigma, exclusion, marginalization, and so on. Education, as we said in the old days, cannot compensate for society. And if these interventions focus, or if the argument for these interventions focus on those kinds of things, then I would feel much more favorable towards them. Sorry, that's just what I said. Right. Of course, the work on the neuroscience of poverty in the early years is not alone. And in fact, those of us who work on the development of health and the development of mental health are probably most familiar with two other arguments that share a lot with this work on the neuroscience of poverty. They are ACE and DOHED. ACE, adverse childhood experiences. DOHAD, the developmental origins of health and disease. And I just want briefly to show you two examples from those areas, and then focus on one very specific example about stress before I wrap up. Sorry. I needed more stimulation in my early years, then I would not have got so confused. Adverse childhood experiences. Here, since we're talking bibliometrically, here on the This is the right-hand side of the screen. On the right-hand side of the screen are indications of the numbers of scientific publications which have adverse childhood experiences in their titles per year, recorded on the Web of Science. And you'll see the huge increase in those. And the idea of the ACE, the adverse childhood experience, partly I think because of the nice little acronym, ACEs, we can count up the number of ACEs, has become really highly pervasive, as you can see by some of the images here. The brain is the only organ not fully developed at birth, it says there. Critical brain development happens in the first year of life. And there are a list here of all the adverse childhood experiences: physical abuse, physical neglect, whether the parents drink too much, whether they take drugs, whether there's violence, whether there's a person in prison, and so on. And there's on the right-hand side of the screen a picture showing you the lifelong impact of the ACEs. Now, there are many, many things that one might say about the ACEs. In particular about that way in which the ACEs have been developed into a scale. So now, because we have a list of the ACEs, there they are: physical abuse, neglect, parents who drink, parent with a mental health problem, parent in prison, etc. You can count up the number of ACEs. If you've got less than 3 ACEs, you're probably okay. If you've got 4 to 7 ACEs, you're in a bit of a difficult situation. If you've got more than 8 or more ACEs, you're pretty much doomed for life. And then you can have all sorts of interventions to try and reduce ACEs. The main argument, and this is from a paper critique of ACEs, the main argument here is that living through ACEs, that is to say living with a parent who is abusive, living with a parent who's alcoholic, living with a parent who has a mental disorder, is going to induce the activation of stress. And stress responses are harmful to biological functioning. Just keep the stress bit in your mind, because I want to come to that before I close. Again, human perceptions and emotions can lead to the stress response, and there's a list of the stress response. You have a cascade of physiological responses to the stress response, and this produces an alteration in the individual's biology that makes them vulnerable to chronic conditions and pathologies over the life course. So the importance of this argument is the argument that the ACEs program your response to adverse conditions across your life course. What happens in the early years programs how you develop across the life course. And as we can see, the idea of the ACE gets to, oh, you can't see it, but I can see it. The idea of the ACE gets turned into all these little screenings, which are highly simplified ways of adding up ACEs, adding up experiences which are completely different, and ticking them off to count up the number of ACEs that an individual might have. So there are many, many criticisms of this ACE kind of argument. But I think if you look at the criticism that is developed here, you can say, well, would this criticism apply equally to the work that's done on the neurobiology of poverty? So this is a paper by Kelly Irving and Del Pierre from just earlier this year. They argue that the targeted level for intervention must be the structural social context in which children are exposed to ACEs and socioeconomic disadvantage, because it's socioeconomic disadvantage that produces all those adverse conditions that are listed as ACEs. The focus, they say, should be placed on conditions that may be adverse to child well-being and how these conditions come about, not on the individual and his and her responsibility, not to incriminate parents, but to develop studies which provide evidence for population-based actions and avoid the possible stigmatization of families and children who lack the means to act. And I'll just read this last one out. Given the strong impact agenda promoted by academic funders contributing to academic career promotion in some cases, there is a clear potential for academics to allow simplistic messages to emerge from their work. I think it's really important that academics do not allow simplistic messages to emerge from their work. So ACE research is based very largely on animal experiments, work with rats and work with mice. ACE research implies a very simple additive relationship amongst different forms of adversity. The evidence that ACEs rely on is an evidence about population differences, but it's extrapolated as if it's a question of individual risks and if it's a question of individual stress in the family. And in the end, it blames the parents for poor lifestyle choices and ignores the effect of adversity across the life course. So the question for colleagues here is the same true about the neuroscience of poverty? A few words about DOHAD, the developmental origins of health and disease. Well, I don't actually think that this diagram, which is a very familiar one, requires a discourse analyst like me to interpret. Oop, you can't see it, I can see it. Sorry. Now I've turned that off. I'll turn that back on. Right. It doesn't require a discourse analyst like me to interpret. Who is visible in this picture of the developmental origins of health and disease? Gosh, it's a mother. Is anything else visible? No, it's a mother and her womb with a fetus in her womb. And you can see that all the framing of ACE, all the framing of DOHAD, perhaps more explicitly than the framing of ACEs, is on the mother and the mother's body. And in fact, if I had other pictures to show you, the argument for DOHAD is that the intervention here, when the mum is pregnant, is too late. Perhaps you should have your intervention on all young women who are fertile, because it's only if you secure the health of the fertile woman's body that you're going to secure an adequate experience for the fetus during pregnancy. Yes, it's the mother, as all these arguments show. It's the assumption about the causal primacy of maternal effects on the development of health and disease, including a piece there in Nature. And many of my colleagues and others have argued for the need to go with DOHAD far beyond that mother-child dyad to look more in more detail at what happens not just beyond those 1,000 days, but in those 1,000 days. And here is an excellent paper on the developmental origins of health and disease, which tries to indicate the need for these kinds of arguments to go beyond the individual maternal body, to look at all these social and political circumstances in which the mother's body and in which the mother-child or the caretaker-child relationship is embedded, if you are really going to understand where the causal pathways for the early experience of the child lie. They don't lie in the mother's behavior, the mother's attitude, the mother's lifestyle. They lie in all these circumstances which are pictured here, which shape the mother's lifestyle and her conditions for living herself. So I don't normally look at papers which deal with these fundamental ethical questions about responsibility. But I found this paper to be rather powerful in its conclusion. The fundamental question, says Headland, about the responsibility relation between individuals and society is a profound dividing line in politics. Where does social collective responsibility cease and where does individual responsibility begin? Epigenetic responsibility should be a societal, collective responsibility, which is not to say that individuals shouldn't care for their own well-being, but it is to say that the responsibility for making that possible, housing standards, working conditions, decent schools, and other structural conditions, ultimately rests with society itself. I want to take one short example before wrapping up. And this is an interesting example because it's an example of a collaboration between a very good neuroscientist called Bruce McEwen, who's done a huge amount of work on the stress response, which I think is very, very good, and his brother, Craig McEwen, who's a sociologist. And the question that the two McEwen brothers asked themselves was, why is it that poor families in the United States have children who themselves grow up to have poor families? And the argument that the McEwens made, if I can get back to that, the argument that the McEwens made was that this is predominantly a consequence of toxic stress and its effects on the development of the brains of children from low socioeconomic status families. They argue that neurobiological research shows this because the development of the prefrontal cortex is, quote, involved in observed SES disparities. They argue that toxic stress alters the structure and functioning of the brain through the release of hormones, and they argue that the consequences appear to include compromised capacities for behavioral and emotional self-regulation, including working memory and executive function. So these are arguments that we've heard before. But if you look at these papers by these two very eminent and careful US researchers, one a researcher on stress and the other a sociological researcher, all, and I'll say that again, all the neurobiological evidence that they cite is from animal models. It's from work with rats. Now, I don't have to repeat, but I will, the rat's brain, in terms of its size, in terms of its complexity, in terms of the experience of the rat over its very, very short life course, is so different from the human brain that we are talking about things which are literally incomparable. The rat's experience of stress, which is often to be deprived of food, to be placed in a freezing cold environment, or to be injected with a toxic substance, is radically different from anything that one might think of as stress in a human being. So how, I wonder, can these two people writing in the annual review of sociology draw upon that evidence without even bothering to look at it? They draw these very complex pictures of the way in which toxic stress shapes the hormonal cascade. And that is all perfectly right. But unless you look beyond that particular neurobiological dyad of the individual animal and its social conditions, you're not going to understand anything about that toxic stress. And if you're looking at why kids fail in school, you certainly can't extrapolate from research on the brains of rodents. You can't extrapolate from the effects of financial hardship and insecurity. Anyone who's looked at the school system or the levels of inequality in the United States who simply ignores the effect of those lifetime consequences of radical differences in income, in exclusion, in access to decent schools, in access to decent housing, and so on. Anyone who ignores that seems to me to be ignoring what's absolutely fundamental. There's an interesting paper by someone called McMichael, written about 20 years ago, which is called Prisoners of the Proximate. Prisoners of the Proximate. What does he mean by prisoners of the proximate? What he means is that when one does these experiments, one tends to look at things that are very closely related to one another. Okay, here's a bit of adversity, stick a rat in a freezing cage, here's the consequence, what it does for its stress levels. The proximate is what one tends to explore. One doesn't go beyond the proximate to explore the distal circumstances that create those proximate relationships. So when we're thinking about this area, we need to attend to the framing of the questions and not just the way in which the arguments are made. Not what is studied, but also often what is not studied. I just want to conclude with 2 slides. So I really work on mental health. And I'm very interested in the consequences of adversity on mental health. But let me conclude with two slides which I think sum up my view. The first is a slide by Laura Sampson and Sandro Galea. For those who don't know Sandro Galea, he's probably one of the most eminent epidemiologists of mental disorder in the United States. And he argues passionately in this recent paper in Frontiers in Psychiatry, quoting the Michael paper that is up on the right-hand side of the screen. He argues passionately, they argue passionately, that if we are to extend beyond proximate risk factors, we must broaden our causal models and learn to apply a social ecological perspective. Population health sciences, they argue, is concerned with the conditions that shape the distributions of health within and across populations and the mechanisms through which these conditions manifest as the health of the individuals. They focus on exposures that are pervasive, ubiquitous, and hence difficult to study. Macro-social factors, social and cultural norms, urbanization, discrimination, political structures, air pollution, poverty, climate change or migration patterns, the forces that surround us and are primarily invisible, even as they have profound implications for the determination of population health. So I think there's a lesson there for the work that's done on the neurobiology of poverty. The United Nations recently published its Convention on the Rights of Individuals to Health. And in that process, they appointed a special rapporteur on the right to health, Mr. Danius Puras. And again, writing in 2019, and this is my last slide, his conclusion was one which I think one needs to bear in mind in working in this area. His words, not mine. States must facilitate, provide and promote conditions in which mental health and well-being can be realized. Fulfilling the right to mental health requires the provision not just of equitable health care and alternatives to the biomedical model, but public mental health interventions that can protect populations from key risk factors. Action outside the health centre, in homes, schools, workplaces and communities. Yes, facilitating the best possible start to life for children through family support and so on, but also through providing an adequate workforce to support these efforts, rethinking how we build resources for social healing, community strengthening, and the promotion of a healthy society. States should formulate national policies aimed at reducing or eliminating the toxicity of the physical and psychosocial environment. I believe that the work that's done on the neuroscience of poverty is largely done by people who have these kinds of concerns at their heart, who believe that in showing the damaging consequences of all these forms of social exclusion on the child's brain, they are bringing to light the necessity of undertaking these kinds of interventions. And yet, the interventions that are proposed are almost entirely on the individual, on the family relationship, on schooling, and on that very, very proximate set of relations. I think one needs to turn the question around and ask these questions, ask the questions that Sampson and Galea ask the questions that Puras asks, and then, yes, then ask how these things affect the child's brain, how these things affect the development of the individual across their life course without a focus on the first 1,000 years as programming, without a belief that what happens in the early years is itself responsible for what happens in the life course as a whole, and without the argument that ultimately knowing exactly where in the brain something happens is somehow the key to finding the right form of intervention. And thank you.
Yes. So, bueno, vamos a tomar un descanso, 10 minutos y volvemos para...
Now we're going to have a 10-minute break and come back for the debate. We are already getting questions via our social media. What time is it? It's 11:52. At 12, we're going to